Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God. Okay, Book of Acts, friendshipgracebrethren.com documents if you want the document. And we are still in the section, the middle section, where the gospel is first being spread to the Gentiles. And we are in the middle of the account of Peter. So we're in chapter 10, verse 13 is where we pick up our account this morning. Chapter 10, verse 13. And this is what we saw last week. Ecstasis, I don't know why that stayed in. Ecstasis, being put out of place. What the word trance means in the text that we just read. Verse 13, and there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This is an interesting passage that I think has caused a lot of people some confusion, including myself from time to time, which is no surprise to any of you. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Remember the scenario. He sees in a vision, or he actually sees, based on the word trance, a sheet come down, and on that sheet are representative samples of all sorts of clean and unclean animals. And Peter, being the good Jewish boy, he's up on the roof, he's hungry, and God presents to him all these things, including unclean things. And he says, "No, Lord, I can't do that." We can assume that Peter recognized who was speaking to him. The word Peter used to address the voice speaking to him was Kyrie, which is translated as Lord, and it's most often used to signify the one to whom you belong. In other words, it is a recognition, but it also can mean sir and so forth. Peter recognized it was God and maybe even Jesus speaking to him. If it was in fact a Christophany and Jesus is speaking to him, imagine what he was thinking. 3 years earlier or so, he watched his friend get executed from a distance, and then he reunited with him and they spent time together, and then Jesus gone. He ascended. And now, if in fact this voice that he is hearing he recognizes as Jesus, then I imagine that the pucker factor was just a little higher for him, right? Peter was a good Jewish boy and had never eaten anything unclean. He had always kept the kosher laws, and a voice came to him a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." Many people argue that this abrogates the kosher laws, making everything permissible to eat. It certainly makes Jesus' words in Mark 7:14-23 easier to understand. It's also in keeping with what Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 4:4. I should have put those in. Let me read those for you. 1 Timothy 4:4. "For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word of God and by prayer." So, what do you think? Was Jesus abrogating or getting rid of, superseding, doing away with, whatever words you want to use, the kosher laws for the good little Jewish boy Peter and all the others? So you're just playing devil's advocate? Yeah, but Peter doesn't have God doesn't have rules for one person that don't apply to other person, right? Does he? Or let me rephrase that. God doesn't have principles that apply to one that don't apply to another. Well, that's the question. Yeah, that's the question. That's a whole different issue. Because there never was a prohibition on alcohol for the Jews. We're talking specifically, did God abrogate the Jewish kosher laws here? We're not talking about Christian liberty. That's what you're talking about. That's a different discussion. Why would you say no based on these verses? Somebody to pick up the other side finally. Pretty hard to based on these verses, right? If we believe that this is an abrogation of the law, that this law has now been done away with, then the commands that were given earlier, that these things are to always be for the Jews throughout all time, then those commands have also been abrogated. Huh? Okay. For the Jews, no. Because we'll go back to the sacrificial system in the millennial kingdom. Correct. And Paul participated in the sacrifices and participated in the vows. So clearly, Jesus' death on the cross didn't abrogate sacrificial system for the Jews. It didn't apply it to the Christians, but it didn't abrogate it for the Jews. Yes, it did. No, I'm not saying that. It may sound like that, but that's not what I'm saying. Clean out your ears. Why will the church and Jews specifically participate in sacrificial system in the millennial kingdom? It's already been completed. Did the sacrifice of an animal ever save a Jew? No. So it's not like they're doing something for their salvation after they're saved, because it never did save them. But the focus maybe changes. Certainly for us in the millennial kingdom it will be changed. The focus will not be as a covering, it'll be as a memorial to our actual salvation. And I suspect that many Jews practicing the sacrificial system after conversion to follow Jesus were doing it in that vein, that they were doing it as a memorial to their salvation, but the practice was still required by the Old Testament law for them. See, the problem we get into is this poor teaching that when Jesus came, The age of law ended and all the law ended, and now we're in the age of grace, and only grace applies. The law never saved anybody, and the law never was... We saw this early in the book of Matthew when Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law. What does that mean? Does to fulfill mean do away with? No, it means complete. I came to complete the law, not do away with the law. And so for the Jews, they were still practicing Jews. Remember, Peter and Paul got into a fight about it because maybe even because of this experience for Peter, he would act like a Gentile when he was with Gentiles, but if there was a Jew around, he would then snub the Gentiles and act like a Jew. And Paul said, that's not the way to do it. That's not kosher, for lack of a better word. It is very complicated. Yeah. Which to me adds so much depth to this story. Is God actually giving him instruction here on something to eat, or is he making an analogy? Yeah, because the idea that he was actually going to skin one of those animals and eat it there on the roof is just, it doesn't fit, right? So he's drawing a picture that this good little Jewish boy that grew up as a fisherman would understand. He's about to reach out into the Gentile world, which was completely contrary to all of his upbringing as a Jew. His upbringing as a Jew was you don't associate with the Gentiles. The teaching of the Pharisees was you stay by yourselves, and our faith is our faith. It's not for the Gentile world unless they want to become Jews. Unless they want to go through the process that takes a long time to become a proselyte Jew. And so Peter is getting the instruction from God. It's not like that. Salvation has come to everyone. Everyone can be holy before God. The voice came to him a second time, what God has made clean, do not call common. How would you view that in the light of salvation? Ephesians 1:4 will help you understand that. Go back to Ephesians 1:4. Anyone who is called by God, what God has made clean, called by God, do not call common. In other words, those that God has called before the foundation of the world, it is okay for them to become followers of Jesus. That's the message that Peter was getting from his conversation with Jesus on the rooftop. Or God, we don't know if it was specifically Jesus. What God has called clean, do not call common. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Right, because that would have been completely contrary to the teaching that he grew up with from the Pharisees. This is a turning point in the ministry of the apostles to the church. Remember, Paul's not an apostle yet. He's been saved, but he hasn't done his seminary yet. So he's still learning. And Peter is the first one that becomes an apostle to the Gentiles. Because God took him to a place where he could recognize that those that God had called, those that God had called clean, we shouldn't call common. It's a whole new paradigm for the for the apostles as they went through this process. I can only imagine that after this happened, particularly after then Peter goes to visit Cornelius, and Cornelius and his family come to know the Lord, Peter goes and he goes to his first apostle meeting, and he says, "You'll never guess what happened. This is what God showed me." I don't think they did that eating shrimp and ribs. I think they still kept kosher. I think Peter understood the picture that was being painted for him. And that was that God calls those to be saved out of every nation, not just the Jews. Now, I admit that is not the common way to understand that passage. I think it's the only way to fit all of the historical information together, but it's not the common way that the church teaches it. I'm not a common guy, so. What did you say? What did you say? What did you say? Wow. It's going to be a tough group today. This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up once to heaven. Peter's a slow learner sometimes, right? You see a pattern in Peter's life? Yeah, everything was done in 3s because he was a slow learner. He just didn't get it. Why did Peter refuse to eat 3 times? He was a good Jewish boy. He's having to learn a completely new paradigm that was completely contrary to everything that he had learned. Completely different. And he didn't do that easily. Peter was obedient to a set of rules that had been exercised completely out of their stated purpose. Did God give the kosher rules to prevent unbelievers, Gentiles, from coming into the Jewish world? No. God didn't give those rules to that. But and God didn't give the clean and unclean rules. God didn't give the fact that the Jews were to be holy people and the rest of the world was unclean and needed to be purified. God didn't give those rules and instructions to keep the unclean out, but to always point out that he is clean and those who follow him are clean. He is holy. Those who follow him are holy. And the Pharisees had completely obliterated that concept, and it made it an us and them. He didn't see immediately the intention of the Lord in offering the food. Peter's intentions were honorable. He intended to obey the law, but here the lawgiver directly commands him in how he was to do this. Peter had a track record of doing things with Jesus in threes. He denied the Lord 3 times. He affirmed his love for the Lord 3 times, etc., etc. So let's move on. Acts 10:17. Now, while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean, behold, men who were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry for Simon's house, stood at the gate, and called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. And while Peter was pondering the vision, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them. And Peter went down to the men and said, I am the one you're looking for. What is the reason for your coming? And they said, Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say. So, Peter is in this, I don't get it, God. I'm still hungry, by the way, God. I don't get it. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. Everything can be clean. I don't get it. Knock, knock, knock. Hey, we got a Gentile up here that needs to know the Lord. Are you coming down? God is bringing events to happen at the time they need to happen in order for Peter to get the message. God does that all the time in our lives. He brings us instruction, and He brings us people to bring us to places. I have a friend who, in our ham radio club, we've lost a couple of friends in the last month. And one of them was pretty shocking. I talked to you about it last week. Right in the middle, he was our Ham Fest coordinator, and right in the middle of the Ham Fest, he died. And I made the offer as the chaplain of the club to talk to anybody that's struggling with it. And I've talked with a few folks, and I went up to an event yesterday to talk to one particular friend who was beginning to suffer from his own mortality. People around him are dying, and as normally happens when you get in your 40s, you begin to, hey, I'm not invincible. I'm not Superman. I'm not immortal. And one of the things I said to him, and I didn't mean it to sound like I was laying the guilt of our friend's death on him, but I said, maybe part of why Drew died was to direct you back to God. He grew up in the church, and I said, maybe that God was using that to get your attention. He understood what I was saying, and I didn't lay all the guilt of Drew's death on his back. I didn't want to, but the point is, I believe Drew came into his life to bring him to a point where he was ready to come back to see God. And God does that all the time. He brings people in our lives. He brings events in our lives. Things happen around us in order for us to be in a place to hear from God. When we're ready to listen. And Peter, he's on the roof praying, and he's hungry, and God shows him this picture about kosher and not kosher food, and go ahead and you can eat it all. What I've called clean, don't you call unclean. And then a messenger dealing with a Gentile that's ready to come to know Jesus is there. Peter starts understanding a little bit about what's going on. What do you think Peter was thinking as the sheet and animals was lifted back into the sky and someone's knocking on the door? Yeah. He's beginning to, there's a little glimmer of light now. A centurion wants to see me because he wants to know the Lord. And he's beginning to, the synapses are beginning to fire, and he's beginning to see, beginning to realize, oh, hey, maybe God has something important for me. He was beginning to see the message of the dream, I believe, or the confrontation. He was starting to see the reality of the inclusion of Gentiles in the church. The church is a brand new deal. It's 3 years old at the most. And he's beginning to recognize maybe the church is not just good little Jewish boys from Galilee. Maybe it includes others. Because not only was he listening to what was said in the trance, but he was also probably remembering some things Jesus said during his ministry. He was remembering maybe things like the Abrahamic covenant, that through the Messiah, all nations will be blessed. I can just imagine all that stuff was flooding into his brain as he was wondering what he's going to do now. As he was thinking about it and what was meant by it and so forth, then the men sent by Cornelius came and they called out for Peter. So he invited them in to be his guests. The next day he rose and went away with them, and some of the brothers from Joppa accompanied him. Peter had been waiting for his lunch, right? When he had the trance, and we don't have record that he's eaten yet. So he's really hungry now. The level of hospitality, which was normal at this time, would require Peter to share his lunch with his guests. So he probably shared what little he had, and the next day they all got up and began their trip to Caesarea. It must have already been too late to begin the trip the day before, so the afternoon had passed. It's not time to walk, and so they spend the evening together. And so you can imagine as they were together, they were having some conversation. Well, does Cornelius want? What's going on? Give me the circumstances. You can imagine all that going on. And the following day, they entered Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. I love that. Cornelius, a gatherer? Yeah, I think so. He doesn't yet know Jesus, but he's gathering people to Jesus. He believes in God, and he has some historical Jewish understanding, but he doesn't yet know Jesus, but he's gathering people together to meet Jesus. When Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshiped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." I love this. This is not the way megachurch pastors act. This is the way a follower of Jesus acts. Don't worship me. I'm just the guy that's bringing you the message. I'm telling you about the guy you need to worship. I'm not the guy you need to worship, is what Peter is saying. So the question I have is, why would Cornelius worship Peter? Why would he think to do that? Yeah. I think really it's based on Cornelius' ignorance of what really is going on. It showed his piety, but it also showed a respect for Peter. But it was an act based on ignorance, as Peter's remark in verse 26 says, "Stand up, I'm too am a man." Cornelius is responding like Peter might be an angel from God, as Linda was saying. Exactly. So the next question that follows then, what was the real danger for Peter? Yeah. If the first spear of the Italian regiment, which is what Cornelius was, the top dog of the Italian forces of the Roman Empire, came and began to worship me, I might just have a little bit of a big head about it. God has blessed me with a woman that doesn't let me have a big head, and she would have popped that bubble real quick, but that's the way it works. I think that was a danger for Peter. I think that was a danger for all the apostles early on. But I think it shows their level of commitment to who God is and to their mission, that they never went for the prideful stuff. Verse 27. And as he walked with him, he went and found many persons gathered. Guess he is a gatherer. And he said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean." Where'd he get that idea? Yeah, exactly. Peter, by the time he's talking to Cornelius, he understands what God was telling him. Yeah, but we do that all the time. We take passages out of context, and on itself it says this, but when you put it in the text of the entirety of Scripture, it says something completely different. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. I asked then why you sent for me. I love this. Somewhere along the trip to Caesarea, Peter understood the vision. So he understood what was going on. Jews were prohibited from going into Gentile residences and fellowshipping with them. Prohibited by the law or prohibited by the Pharisees' interpretation of the law? Yeah. I think that might be a hardening of the law and not a real true interpretation of the intent of the law. God did want them to always maintain a sort of separation and an understanding that they are different because they were his chosen people. But I don't think the prohibition of ever entertaining Gentiles is part of what we see in the 613 Old Testament laws. It certainly was an adoption by the Pharisees. But Peter wasn't thwarted, and he traveled with them and responded without delay. What's the message for us in the way Peter responded? Yeah, exactly. Is obedience timed? Is obedience tied to timing? I know in my house growing up it was. I couldn't wait a couple of days to do what my mom had told me to do. That wasn't obedient. Obedient was do it now. Do it when you're told. Because what happens when you wait a couple of days? You forget. Which was the plan, by the way. Well, yeah. Sometimes. And then you really got it. Woo, doggies. So obedience requires immediacy. Requires doing it when you're told to do it. Yeah, it requires a timely response. That's a good way to put it. So Peter was being obedient, and he was teaching us, when God tells you to do something, just get off your butt and do it. Don't delay. Because that puts obedience in question marks. And Cornelius said, 4 days ago, about this hour, I was praying in my house, and at the 9th hour, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing. Wonder who that is. And said, Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodging in the house of Simon, a tanner by the sea. So I sent for you at once, and you have been kind enough to come. Now therefore we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. Yeah, he's a gatherer. Go ahead.
Back to something you said last week that you believe that Simon the Tanner was kind of relevant because even though he was unclean Jew,
Right.
He was still staying in a Jewish home.
I think so.
Considering the other people unclean,
Right.
and other nations unclean.
I think so, yeah. But I wouldn't call Simon the tanner an unclean Jew. I'd call him ceremonially unclean. And he'd have to go through extra steps in order to go to the temple and worship. When Peter got to Caesarea, he met up with Cornelius, and Cornelius told Peter something that must have caused the hair on the back of his head to stand up. Think about it. He told Peter that at 3 p.m. 4 days earlier, he had a sudden visit from a man in shining clothing. He recounted the instructions he was given to send for Peter. Notice the faith of Cornelius in verse 33. So I sent for you at once, and you have been kind enough to come. Now therefore we're all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. He trusted that the instructions he was given by the man in the bright clothes, whoever that may be, to do it, to call for Peter, and then he gathered all his friends so that everybody was together ready to hear from Peter when Peter got there. He acted in faith. Clearly, he acted in faith. Imagine what Peter was thinking as he recalls going through the sheet, the trance of the sheet, clean and unclean animals, and the discussion. No, God, I'm not going to do that. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. Kept on going back and forth, only to find out that was all planned by God in order to make him prepared for this moment. The hairs on the back of his neck had to be just tingling a little bit. His spidey senses had to be saying, hey, something big is about to happen. A big deal is about to go on because of the way God has orchestrated all these things. So when you're driving, you're guilty, huh? Got it. I'd call that a guilty conscience, but yeah, I think Peter had a little fear and trepidation because, right, maybe his reputation was known enough because he was approved by the Jewish nation, as we've read. Maybe his reputation was known enough, but he's still the guy from the other side that has the boot on our neck. So there had to be a sense of that. And I think that contributes to Peter's heightened anticipation to see a great miracle that God is about to do. I'm going into the lion's den, as it were, at the direction of God on instructions that didn't quite make sense when I got them, that are now making sense. Cornelius is responding to instructions from God that he trusted in faith but didn't understand. All of this is coming together. Yeah, the spidey senses had to be, oh, this could be bad or this could be really, really good. It's not going to be an ordinary day for Peter. This is going to be a big day. Big day positive, big day negative, but it's going to be a big day. Did you have a question or something you were going to say? I just walked right over you. I got it. That's scary, isn't it? It's scary when somebody gets in your head like that. Linda does it to me all the time. So Peter opened his mouth and said, "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. What I have called clean, don't ever call common." Peter got the message. He got it in time to tell Cornelius, it's okay. If you're called by God, you're okay. That's the message that Peter was replying to Cornelius with. But in many ways, these words were revolutionary and extraordinary. For at least 400 years from the time of the Babylonian captivity until the time of the Pharisees, the Jews had been indoctrinated with this anti-Gentile conspiracy, if you will. With this statement by Peter, the 40-plus years of prejudice was disposed of, at least as it relates to Christians' response to Gentiles. I should say Jewish Christians' response to Gentiles. 400-plus years of misinformation was being dealt with by this one action of Peter. Hey, how does this statement by Peter conform to the Jews being God's chosen people? This is where we get into a little bit of difficulty sometimes. Go back to verse 33. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. But the Jews are God's chosen people. So how do we equate those two things at this point? Certainly the Jews are that. Correct? Paul said so. Not this Paul. He probably said it too, though. What do we have happening right then? We have the age of the Gentiles beginning, the church age, the age of grace. The Jews are still God's chosen people, but what has he done with them? For this age, he set them on the shelf and said, I'll deal with you guys again later. Right now, I'm going to focus on the world, on the people that I've called to be followers of Jesus. A day's coming when they'll be pulled off the shelf. What day is that? It's not a Wednesday, if you're thinking of a day of the week. Well, it might be a Wednesday. True. Right. Right. When the rapture occurs and the church is gone, the church age is done, and we return to an age that focuses on the Jews. We call that the tribulation, which ushers in then the millennial kingdom, which is all about the Jews as first among equals in the world, where Jesus sits on the throne of the world in Jerusalem and rules. So he's not done with the Jews. The church hasn't replaced the chosen people, but God has new chosen people for a period of time. He will return to those chosen people in his scheme of time. How were people saved in the Old Testament, and is that different than how people are saved today? Here's where the church gets it wrong. How were the Old Testament saints saved? Yeah, always through faith. Never by the sacrificial lamb. What did the lamb do? It simply covered their sin. It didn't remove their sin. It covered them. Every year they had to go back and cover them again. It appeased God is a way to view that. I think that's probably a bad way to view it, but in a way, it appeased God. But they were saved when they trusted God for their future. When they trusted God to save them. So really, there's no difference, right? Adam and Eve, if they were saved the same way. They depended on God for salvation. They couldn't do it themselves. So then why did God go through the entire Old Testament and provide us the picture that he did of the sacrificial system, the tabernacle and the temple and so forth? Why do we have 1,500 years of Jewish existence and the sacrificial system if it wasn't how they were saved? It's an illustration of real salvation, the real sacrificial lamb. It's a type or a leading up to a setting the stage for what was coming. One more question. Explain verse 35. Does it teach salvation by works? But in every nation, everyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is acceptable to him. Does that teach salvation by works? Some would say yes. Yeah. Fear here is trusting him and reverencing him. It is looking at him with awe and trusting him for salvation. I think I need to end there and end on time for a change because it's a good transition point. Any questions? Probably lots of questions, but any other questions? Father, thank you for allowing us to see this account of Cornelius and his faith. He trusted. He didn't know what he was trusting yet, but he trusted when given instructions to do something. He did them. And you provided salvation to him through Peter coming and to talk to him. Thank you for that, Father. Thank you that Peter was willing to learn and to grow and learn the lesson that anyone can be your follower, not just the Jews. Thank you for that. Give us a great time in the service to follow, that you might be honored and glorified, that we might worship you and fellowship and study your word. We love you in Jesus' name.
Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. Please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.